Eroticism is the brink of the abyss. I'm leaning out over deranged horror. At this point, my eyes roll back in my head. The abyss is the foundation of the possible. We're brought to the edge of the same abyss by uncontrollable laughter or ecstasy. From this comes a questioning of everything possible. This is the stage of rupture, of letting go of things, of looking forward to death. George Bataille's meditations on the dissolution of a world bound by the fetters of fascism, capitalism, and the labyrinth of modernity continue to resonate as we remain ensnared in a vortex of forces ultimately opposed to the liberation of forms of life. Bataille's sublime fusion of the beautiful with the grotesque, the ecstatic with the horrific, and his vision of a transformed world are just a few of the reasons that Acid Horizon and myself at Left Hand and our collaborator Noah Trapolino, aka Penkeeper, have chosen to center our first independently published work around Bataille's ideas. This project, titled Acephalus, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, features original artwork by Noah and marks a new direction for us. This is no ordinary oracle. We designed this tarot deck as a kind of teaching tool, accompanied by a series of essays and writings from contributors associated with the podcast. Our foray into self-publishing has been made possible thanks to the encouragement of a vast network of supporters and followers. In recent times, some entities in left-wing publishing have encountered various challenges, to say the least, and we aim to navigate these by bringing some of our work in-house and funding it through crowdfunding. Although it's not a perfect model, it brings our readers and listeners closer to the work and directly involves those invested in its success. We're reaching out for your support in a big way. On October 31st of 2024, we're launching our Kickstarter campaign for Acephalus with a short window to bring this vision to life. If you're listening in October or November of 2024, now is the time to take action. Maybe close this podcast, grab your laptop or mobile device, and head to our Kickstarter link in the show notes. There, you can become a patron of the project and purchase a limited edition tarot deck and compendium. Or you can support one or the other, or both. Also, if this book simply isn't for you, but you want to see Acid Horizon succeed in this publishing venture, just navigate to the Kickstarter page and make a donation that's comfortable for you. These funds go into producing the ensemble of work and will also go back into supporting the podcast and its related projects. Speaking personally, this work has become my life. I left a well-paying job and education to pursue something rare and closer to the heart. And today, I make a fraction of what I once did, but this project nourishes my soul. It brings us great joy to host discussions with authors, philosophers, poets, musicians, and activists. We regularly hear from our listeners who say our conversations have inspired them or sparked meaningful shifts in their lives, and we cherish that. Let's keep that legacy alive as we embark on new ventures like Acephalus. And please lend your support today.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. I'm Will, in for Craig today. Our guest today really needs no introduction for most of our listeners, but I'm going to give you one anyway. Today, we have Yuk Hui on, who's going to discuss his upcoming book, Machine and Sovereignty for a Planetary Thinking. Yuk Hui, as I said, is a philosopher who truly needs no introduction, whose work is in conversation with everyone from Stiegler to Heidegger to Simondon to Foucault and so on, and now Carl Schmitt and Teilhard, whose works range from really the most fundamental elements of political ontology all the way through to thinking about technicity. Of course, most of you will know his work, An Essay in Cosmotechnics, the question concerning technology in China, as well as for those of you who work on Simondon, on the existence of digital objects. But we're very excited to have Yuk Hui on, as we've dealt with the question of recursivity and cybernetics extensively on this program. So I just want to thank you for coming on today.
Right, yeah, thank you very much for the generous introduction. It's my pleasure to discuss with you.
We're very happy to have you on. I just wanted to talk to you today about first the subtitle of this book, which is For a Planetary Thinking. So your book opens with a really broad and I think quite strong assertion that though we can conceive of things at a sort of planetary level through logistics, ecology, and cybernetics, we are still not thinking planetarily. And of course, for a lot of us, that will remind us of, Heidegger's astounding claim that we are still not yet thinking, right? And I was wondering if you could explain to us one of the basic premises of your book, which is that though we engage in practices that are planetary, we do so without thinking planetarily. Can you explain sort of what the sort of crux of that claim is and what the political implications of that are?
Right. Maybe first of all, let me try to explain a little bit, to give a little bit more information about this book. This book is actually intended to be the third volume of a series of writings, starting with recursivity and contingency. So after I finished recursivity and contingency, it was 2018. As you may know, that this book is about cybernetics, it's about epistemology. So it's a book that trying to read the history of modern European philosophy through a succession of epistemological changes, let's say mechanism, organism, vitalism, organology, and so on. And that is also how I read Kant, how I read Schelling and Hegel, and so on. In 2018, after I finished the manuscript of recursivity and contingency, I had a wish to write a book about the implication of this reading in political thought, but I was not capable. It was not the time for me to write this for various of reasons, and I had to continue with the second volume, that's Art and Cosmotechnics, which you read, because the book is also dealing with recursivity and contingency, but from a different perspective, but also a different domain, which is art. And this book was after Art and Cosmotechnics I was in the process of writing. I actually started this project on machine and sovereignty. So machine and sovereignty is intended to be the third volume dedicated to. So if the first one is dedicated to epistemology and metaphysics, the second one is on art and aesthetics. The third one, whereas the most recent one, is about political thought, political philosophy, and technology. Now, as you can see, that normally in my previous work, I didn't have subtitle. But this book has subtitle because my publisher forced me to have one. I always charge myself in terms of choosing titles, but my publisher said, no one is going to, but they have other considerations, and they hope that there will be an eye-catching subtitle that explain what the book is about. But the subtitle, Planetary Thinking, is basically a response to what is really happening now, as we know about the climate crisis, but also the Anthropocene, as well as many kind of business campaigns to immigrate to Mars, to the moon and to the other planet and so on. So when I was working on this book, it seems to me that we are in a quite different epoch now to think where we are. And this is a very interesting standpoint. We are actually on a very interesting standpoint where actually we are not sure where exactly it is. In 1958, when Hannah Arendt published the book Der Aktiva, that on the first page she claimed that the Sputnik event was not second to any scientific event in the 20th century. Because it was also the first time that the human being is able to observe the Earth from outside. Now, before we only look at the other planet on the Earth, we are grounded on the Earth. That's also why Husserl was able to write about the original arc, not the Earth as the original arc that does not move. But apparently something has changed since the Sputnik. But of course, later in the 1960s, it was the first time that we were able to see the blue marble taken by the satellite outside of the Earth from the outer space. And it was the first moment that the human being is able to see the Earth as an object, a clear object, as an image. And this, of course, led to Heidegger's interview in the 1960s with the Spiegel, because he just saw these pictures. He just saw these pictures. He was very shocked, and he understood very clearly that cybernetics has completed something, completed image. The Earth is now grasped or seized as an object that is open for intervention, to design, to modification, and so on. So what happened in the second half of the 20th century is actually it opened a new episode for the human being to think about where we are, where we're heading to, and so on. So in the past years, we know very clearly the climate crisis and so on, that we have entered into the so-called Anthropocene. That's to say, the humans are now, or the human activities affect the geochemical reactions of the Earth. And it affirms the domination of the human over other non-human species. And so, of course, this is planetary in the sense that we are not talking about one, let's use the old terminology, that one race against the other. Of course, it still exists and it's still a problem. But the situation has changed a lot in the 20th century. That's why I try to address the question of the planetary. But before I explain further, I would like to make a distinction between what I call the planetary thinking and what is called planetarization. Now, planetarization is a term used also by Heidegger already in the 1930s and this term planetarization was closely related to technology, to technological globalization for him. Not because the technological development or the whole process of modernization, a process of planetarization. And but of course, retrospectively, we can say that it has to do also with colonization, with globalization, and so on. So it has a long history to think of the process of planetarization. On the one hand, but on the other hand, there is in parallel there is a history of a history of, maybe we can call a history of political forms. And by political form, I mean political forms such as the Greek polis, the Roman Empire, the modern state, and the Großraum of Carl Schmitt, and so on. So the history of planetarization and the history of political forms are actually closely related, or we cannot really separate the two. So now when I propose a planetary thinking is actually in tension with the process of planetarization, because I propose to think of what my philosophy, or what can philosophy do, or what kind of philosophical thought can we develop to cope with this process of planetarization? What kind of intervention can we have, or what would be the contribution of philosophy? And when you start the book, especially already in the preface, I started the preface with discussion with Carl Mitcham, who is an American philosopher working on technology since a long time, where he dedicated his life to the philosophical study of technology. And he was the inaugural president of the American Society for Philosophy and Technology. And we once had a conversation, and he said to me that there is no political philosophy of technology. That's to say, the relation between political philosophy and technology seems to be so remote, even though it is so clear to everyone that today you want to do politics or you want to study political philosophy, you cannot avoid the question of technology. So that was these are the motivations that kind of push me to look into this process of planetarization, the history of planetarization and the history of the political forms. And from there, through this analysis, I try to sketch what a planetary thinking, or what kind of planetary thinking can we think about or can we speak about. Because I'm not proposing a solution at all because I don't think anyone in the world can provide a solution to the problem that we have now. But it is important that we approach the problem from different point of view, from different angles, trying to understand, and at the same time allow us to reread the history of philosophy from the problems that we are confronting.
I really appreciate the point that you make about the connection between planetarization and colonization, because it also helps us understand that with this planetarization that sometimes comes in as sometimes a cosmic nihilism, right? We're so small in the scale of the world picture. It introduces this epistemology of insignificance, which is really actually just a kind of framing of a new form of domination. So I really appreciate the introduction of politics into planetarization, especially when we look at the relationship between colonization and the practice of logistics, which sometimes where politics has sometimes been excised from that discussion. But I have a follow-up question then, especially on your point that planetary thinking is an attempt to introduce a kind of philosophical intention with the process of planetarization. I'm wondering what this might have to do with, say, a kind of an ethics put forward by thinkers like Heidegger or Rainer Sherman, where the function of, it's been translated as reflection or mindfulness, Besinnung, plays a role here. Do you think that there was a sort of missed connection in these sorts of thinkers who were dealing with the philosophy of technology, now that certain texts from Sherman and Heidegger are now just being translated, specifically Sherman, where the sort of question of ethics and technology are sort of both arriving but not quite being connected in the way that you seem to want them to be?
I actually didn't yet finish answering your first question.
That's okay.
Which is the question of the unthought of planetary. But maybe let me add one brief point and then we continue with that. It's because now when we talk about planetary thinking, we always think of something big. So we wanted to think about the whole, for example, planetary computation. We want to think about planetary transformation, or even I think of intergalactic communication and so on. But this for me is not really about a planetary thinking. When we're just looking at something big, it's not really thinking at all. Because I think for me actually, I take a rather opposite direction of thinking, because to think planetarily, we actually need to connect to the locality, because we always observe from a locality. When for example, even when we talk about cosmology, when you look at the sky from Europe, it's very different from the sky you see in Argentina, right? So our connection to the cosmos, our connection to what is outside is always limited, enabled by a particular point of view. So planetary thinking doesn't necessarily mean that we aim for the biggest. Of course, we have to be very cautious about scale, because scale is a big question. But it doesn't mean that the bigger we think, the better it is. And I think this was a very already discussed, for example, in by Heidegger and Schumann and so on. Now, the second thing you mentioned about is a colonization. Colonization is not a history of the past. It's nothing of the past. Colonization is something that continues, but in a different form. Right. So, for example, in the book, I had a discussion also with Alexander Kojev, and where I tried to understand because in the 1950s, Kojev was invited by Carl Schmitt to give a lecture in Cologne in Germany. And if you read the book, it's on chapter 5. And where I discuss about that, and Kojev gave a lecture called Colonialism from European Perspective. Kojev basically said that the previous colonization is a colonization of taking. So you the colonizer take from the colonized. And interestingly, he linked this colonization of taking with Marx analysis of capitalist. So he says, if we read Marx, we have the impression that capitalists always take things, until the limit, from the workers, such as the colonizers did to the colonized. Then he said, but this is stupid. This is not the right way to do it. He said, if you take too much, your clients become poorer and poorer. Then you cannot take anymore. Right? If a capitalist exploits the worker until the limit, then the worker does not produce anymore. So you cannot just take. Right. So what Marx described for him is just a kind of stupid capitalism. And the colonization that based on taking is also a quite low level colonization. So he proposed that the new colonization or new colonialism must be colonialism of giving. So you give, for example. Now this is particularly interesting because Carl Schmitt is a thinker of taking, of Nehmen. That is the origin of nomos and taking. You take the land, you take the sea, and so on. And Kojev's lecture actually hinted on something quite different. Not take, but to give. So, for example, he said in the 1950s, the country they gave were, for example, Great Britain, France, for example, that you give. So you help the other countries, the colonized countries, or the so-called third world country to build their infrastructures and so on. And later, of course, in this term, colonialism of giving was not mentioned anymore in what we call globalization, because globalization sounds much better than colonialism of giving. But there's not much difference when we think about this. Like, for example, when the Americans force other countries to open the market and then they can build factories there in India, in China, and so on, or maybe what China is doing today is also not too far from that. So that's why I said that the history of colonization persists until our time as well, and that is an essential part of planetary, and we can think it is further of, for example, the transfer of technology, the development of infrastructure, especially logistic infrastructure, and so on. So, and I think Heidegger, in his time, did already kind of sense this process of planetarization. But in related to what you said, because I remember you said you referred to what Heidegger called Besinnung. And in a passage, Heidegger says that, but in the 1930s, he said that the Japanese are doing the same thing. It's not only the Europeans. there's a kind of numbness towards this process of civilization. So I think that today we already 100 years, almost 100 years after Heidegger said this, and actually we don't need Heidegger to tell us about this, and that we are in a very different epoch where the technological planetarization is realized. And that is why we have more and more discussions about the planet, about planetary immigration, and so on.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the way that because I remember the way that you discussed Schmitt's understanding of the Monroe Doctrine. And what's interesting here is your framing of this sort of planetarization or globalization and Kojève's sort of new age of colonialism. There seems to be that break between like the Monroe Doctrine, right, with sort of Theodore Roosevelt as the sort of apex in American foreign policy of the Monroe Doctrine, and then of course the Marshall Program becoming sort of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Marshall becoming sort of an image of what foreign policy would look like in this age of marketization and the expansion of logistics. To that end, I want to ask a question then, just about, because we've sort of bitten around the edges of cosmotechnics, and I didn't want to bring you on just to force you to constantly just re-articulate sort of one of your foundational contributions. But I just wanted to sort of talk about at a very, very fundamental level what you think the difference between, say, machine technology and the kind of technology that, say, more lay individuals like myself, I don't know, would mean when we hear the word technology, and the ontological notion of sort of technique or technics that we get from Hillel, Stiegler, Heidegger, Schurman, et cetera, and where you find yourself in this dispute in the philosophy of technology, because there seems to be sort of an attempt to sort of free oneself from the ontological trap, as certain thinkers like Rancière call it. And I'm wondering if you think that it's helpful to make this distinction, or harmful to make the distinction between sort of capital T technology and then individual sort of technologies.
Because what you said about the 2T is something that was discussed in the last century, not, if I remember correctly, what was called the empirical term. But I think, the empirical term is another problem. Let's go back to the term technology or techniques and so on, because there is a difficulty of translating this word. And translating, of course, we have to say translating from what language to what language. And because tech in ancient Greek means to build with wood. So you have carpenter. Of course, in Homer, we know about building ship. And I work on the etymology of this word in the question concerning technology, because techne has a very limited scope in ancient Greeks. Let's say in the time of Homer, because at the time medical doctor was not yet a profession, so you don't refer techne to a medical doctor. Only later, for example, in Plato and so on. So in the French language, there is what that is often referred to both technique, like how to do things, but only later there is this word technology was used, and it referred more to modern technology, to industrial technology. So if you say in French technology, it refers more to industrial technology. And so when Stiegler's book La Technique et le Temps was translated into English, they had to render it into techniques and time, and techniques, TICHNICS, is actually not a word that is often used in the English language. It's actually a very strange word because of the difficulty of translating, or there's a lack of distinction of different kind of techniques in the French language, but of course also in the German language, because Heidegger's famous text, his conference in 1949 and later published in 1953, Die Frage nach der Technik, translated into English as the question concerning technology, but he was talking about technique, and it's not about it's not technology. It's Die Frage nach der Technik, and throughout the text, of course, we understand that the industrial technology was called modern technique, right? So there is an ambiguity on this word, but if you go into Jacques Ellul, that is even more complicated, because he claimed that the Greek technique, not all, but a lot of the Greek technologies actually came from the Near East. For example, Persia and so on. There's no original. What we know about Greek technology is not from Greece, but from Egypt, from Persia, and so on. So there is a big difficulty, philologically, etymologically, when we address the question of techniques. So, but for me, I try to divide this to understand, to use these terms very carefully, because for me, techniques. And this is out of the way I use these words is because of this limit, and then I try to make it so. Techniques, the TECHNICS, I would use these words to describe all forms of know-how. Be that. But if I say this, it's because we are speaking in English and we have the difficulty to stay in the English language. So I use techniques to describe all forms of know-how, and I reserve the word techne to the Greek concept of techne, which means at the same time art and technology, and I reserve the word technology to what Heidegger called modern techniques. That's to say industrial technology. And so there is a difficulty or ambiguity of using these words, but that is my schema of using these words. But your question is about, if I understand correctly, your question is rather about, well, let's give up asking what is the essence of technology, and let's look at technology 1, technology 2, or A and B and C. That's what the empirical term suggests. That let's don't talk about the essence of technology, and and by doing this, of course, it transforms philosophy to sociology, because that concerns fact and so on. But social fact, or maybe we can say technical fact in that sense. I don't think that we need to. I don't think that we need to reject the empirical term, but we definitely have to see that it is not sufficient. Well, I don't need to talk about this, but there is also a lot of debates, historical debates on sociology, on philosophy against sociology, and so on. So, of course, in our everyday life, we adjust. We have to deal a lot with our empirical experience, and we have to deal with this object and that object. But I think at the same time, if we only think in this way, we get lost. We get lost in the object.
I have to admit, I share a certain sympathy there as someone who jeers whenever I see sociology students and professors commandeering Foucault away. But I wanted to ask now a more specific question about cosmotechnic, just in general, because one of the things that I find quite interesting is your book contends all three, but also the essay on cosmotechnics in the question concerning technology in China, that you argue sort of how does, to put it more fundamentally, how does Stiegler's basic thesis in Technics and Time, the fault of Epimetheus, on the co-constitutive sort of non-origin origin of technics with the equiprimordial givenness of Dasein square with your theory of cosmotechnics? Because I've always wondered, how do you receive that basic account of technics in the fault of Epimetheus when it's given a sort of equiprimordial position? Because it seems to me that your thesis and his are opposed, and yet there are some sort of fascinating ways in which you're really trying to find ways to work along the same lines as Stiegler. So I've always just wanted to personally ask you that question.
Yeah, very good question. I think when I was writing the question concerning technology in China, when I was writing it, at a certain moment I feel a little bit scared. I had a little bit of fear because it's because I know that Bernard, he was my teacher and we were very close, might read it as a critique of him. He might read it as a criticism. But for me, it's more important. It's always important to advance thinking than being discouraged by this thing. So this, when he read, where I sent him a copy and the book was dedicated to him, but I think Bernard, after he read the first 40 pages, he told me that he could not read it. Because his reason is that he disagree with what I said about Ontology. But of course, the question of memory, or maybe we can say that Bernard justifies his philosophy of memory actually through the anthropology of Ontology. But for me, in the book, what I raise is an antinomy. An antinomy between what I call the antinomy of the universality of technology, but also the antinomy that we find in contemporary anthropology, for example, in the work of, for example, Philippe Descola, Veros de Castro, and on the other hand, the work of Ontology. And this is, of course, very strange, and maybe I don't know enough about the history of that, but I suspect that it is because of some stupidity, intellectual stupidity, as we all have among the academicians. There was virtually no discussion between, a dialogue between the work of Lévi-Strauss and André Leroi-Gourhan. We know that Lévi-Strauss was very much interested in cosmology and so on, religions and cosmology. But André Leroi-Gourhan was the opposite. He basically he said, nowadays the anthropologists, when they pose these questions, they deal with cosmology and religion. They abandon the question of technology. So that was also quite interesting when we look at the chair of Philippe Descola earlier. Now he retired at the Collège de France. He was the chair of anthropology of nature. The stand against the philanthropology of techniques. And only later, when I was reading another conversation, a dialogue book with Philippe Descola, that he basically recalled this history in that by passing, he said, at the time, because of some personality, questions, the different schools, including Lévi-Strauss and Leroi-Gourhan, they didn't talk to each other. Right. So I mean, this is of course certain kind of academic history, but even you can classify it as scholarships and so on. But what I want to say is that by trying to show that there is an antinomy at work concerning the question of technology, and in the book you find that already in the introduction I try to formulate what I call the antinomy on the universality of technology, but in the very much in the Kantian sense. That's to say, when you separate the thesis and the antithesis, each of them stands, but when you put them together, then you find a seemingly contradiction between the two. So antinomy is not, when I say it is antinomy, actually it's not a way to reject what Stiegler said, but rather to pose the question as an antinomy in order to open it up, also to open open up a space for investigation into the question of technology. So in the second part of my book, I return to Derrida, I return to Stiegler on the second part on the question of memory. So I start by saying that there are different cosmotechnics, and of course this referred also to cosmology and so on. And I try to redefine the concept of technology through what I call the cosmotechnics. And in the second part, I went back to the question of memory. But I was very close to Bernard, and even though he was angry, but he still needed me. So he continued and he finished reading the book, and I think we have certain kind of we still have a certain kind of different reading of Großraum, but in a way I think we reconcile, not complete. We do have arrived at certain consensus, and that's why before he died he talked about technodiversity. And technodiversity is something I developed from the question concerning technology in China, and I elaborate in recursivity and contingency in the last chapter. That suddenly it was almost dramatic. The last chapter has a dramatic effect, and that's what I planned to. I wrote it as a drama in the last chapter. So he's. I think we agreed on certain points on the question of technodiversity, the need to develop further the concept of technodiversity, and that was also his last published paper as a response to me. So maybe let me go back to this book. Not recursivity. Let me go back to the book Machine and Sovereignty. And the last two chapters of this book is about technodiversity. I trying to bring it into where I try to describe or try to clarify its relevance to political philosophy. That was the last two chapters. But you have the book, and you know that the first three chapters is on Hegel, on the concept of where the first two chapters is on Hegel's political state. And the third chapter is on the planetary speculations that you can range from George Kuhorden to Teilhard de Chardin. And there are two chapters on Carl Schmitt, and then follow with two chapters of the agenda that I would like to propose.
I think that that's a really productive and helpful response, especially as I was working through in my grad work, and a friend of mine just presented his dissertation on Stiegler and time within video. It was a fascinating dissertation on. I was shocked by how enraptured I was on a thesis on video games. But he was working a lot with the sort of tension in Stiegler's conception of time, and I just really wanted to sort of pry at you there on that sort of productive divergence and tension between your work and Stiegler's. I want to now take us all the way back to Aristotle, with whom I think most of these inquiries tend to start, not because of hylomorphism, but often because of sort of the foundational space that technique seems to have. In the Aristotelian Doctrine of Politics. And I was wondering if, while this book, especially in its concluding chapters, move towards a politics around technology. And this is a move sort of similar to, the mode of being of technical objects. Of course, you take a different, I think, a divergent stance from the basic one laid out by Simondon. I was wondering, though, if you could comment at all about the role. You spend a lot of time in the early chapters talking about the relationship of politics to sort of, I don't have a better word for this, but like fractures in technology and fundamental epical changes in technology. And I was wondering if we could also read your book as an attempt to both find politics as a form of technology as well. Because in Aristotle's Politics, in the very first book, or in the very first chapter, Aristotle explicitly calls politics a techne. I don't think he goes as far as to say it's a techne peribion, but he does refer to politics explicitly as this form of technique that is particular to zoon politikon, which has all of these other, extremely important implications. But I was wondering if one could, if they were reading your book with a certain level of care, argue that it might not only be looking for a politics of technology, but also a way to more fundamentally understand politics as a technology.
Right. I think let me make a distinction first. The book is not about politics of technology. The book is set to respond to what we might call a political technology discourse. In the sense that politics and technology cannot be separated as two, and this is the fundamental, that's the point of departure. Because earlier on, we also talked about the question of the unthought. Like what Derrida and like what Stiegler after him claimed that the question of technology remained unthought in the history of philosophy. That in the history of philosophy, there is an active repress of the question of technology. I mean, of course, we can leave this question open for debate, but that is why they claim, especially in Stiegler, that technique is the unthought in the sense, and it's repressed. The question of technology is repressed. It might be the same when we look into political philosophy, that it's not about a politics of technology, like how to use weapons and so on. Of course, if you in every war you will see this, how to improve your defense power, how to invent or develop stronger weapons, and with Leonardo da Vinci was used for the purpose. That he was a painter, he was everything, but he was very active in the military because he has developed all these technologies. So it would be oxymoron to say that there's no question of technology in politics, but actually in war, it's all about technology. But so what I was saying here when I'm talking about attractors is that we need to render visible the question of technology in political philosophy, and that is the aim. And that is why I decided to start with Hegel, to show that Hegel was the person who tried to make this clear, that the development of the political form from the Greek polis to the political state has to be understood as a genetic process, in his sense, the dialectical process of dialectical relation between the Erinnerung and an Äußerung of recollection and externalization or alienation, as sometimes is translated into English. So that's the first response. The second point you mentioned is about Aristotle and isn't politics a technique? Of course, because for the group, technique means to do things, means the knowledge of know-how. Of course, it can be applied for many things. Like, for example, the sophists also have a technique. The rhetoric is also a technique, and so on. But interestingly, when we look into the politics of Aristotle, there was one very peculiar passage when he wanted to discuss if a technician can be a citizen or not. So if you are a mechanical worker, he thinks a mechanical worker cannot be a citizen.
He explicitly uses the term posture, right? The orthos of that human being. It goes for him, the depth of the non-citizen is real. I think it's historically not adequately delved into. In fact, like I think Agamben's at the end of his 10 books, he finally gets to it, and then the series ends, right? But
right, I mean, because if you read the Republic, when Plato and the Republic, when he started, of course, kind of the Republic with 5 kind of people, and then you slowly see that the technique plays a very important role in the building of the Republic. In that, because you cannot ask a shoemaker to repair or to build a well for you, because that is not how the shoemaker could be used. And so in the Republic, everyone or every technician should be able to develop his or her strength, but of course not her, because women cannot be a citizen at the time. So it can only be male. But in Aristotle, it's really interesting in the Republic that in the politics, and that that is not the case. That I'm not very sure if he said I'm not very sure if a mechanical worker can even become a citizen, and so on. But what I want to say is that, of course, we can say that politics is a kind of technique and so on, but I think we are still stay in a kind of very ambiguous concept of technique. Like what Hegel we criticize Spinoza by saying that everything is one, and there's no clarity, or like what Hegel later accused Schelling, that all the counts are black in the dark night. So I think that is one of the something we have to pay attention to when we deal with classics like in Aristotle and Plato and so on. So the aim is really for me to look into the relation between political philosophy and technique. And this is not my training, of course. I was not a specialist of political philosophy, and I was, of course, forced to. I need to read all these classics, even though I studied them before. But you really have to study them very carefully. And of course, it was really interesting when I tried to look at the landscape of political philosophy in the 20th century, and I was drawn to Lewis Strauss' lectures and his writings and so on. And there was a really no question of technology in his reading of the political and the history of political philosophy. There was only one occasion he talked about technology. He said to his students in Chicago that there's an interesting guy who is not yet translated into English, but we should pay attention to him. His name is called Martin Heidegger. That was the one occasion, if I remember correctly, that Lewis Strauss really talked about technology, but it was a very much Heideggerian inspiration. So that was the aim of the project. To maybe I can say to relate the history of political philosophy from the perspective of technology, and this immediately raise a methodological problem. How am I going to do this? What kind of methodology could I employ in order to study such a long history? And because it's almost impossible, if I have to deal with in great details the political thought of every thinker. So I had to develop a methodology in order to deal with this, and that is in the book I try to formulate what I call the political epistemology as a way to read, and also as a way to reintegrate the question of technology into political philosophy.
No, it's really helpful, and I'm drawn now to the question about Teilhard de Chardin, but I'll hold off on that for now and just ask, because we're still technically on the topic of Aristotelian metaphysics. One of the passages that I found sort of extremely powerful was when you spent time on Hegel's reading of De Anima. Of course, all of the fundamental German philosophers, all in one way or another, have their fundamental reading of De Anima, and you focus in on Hegel's, and you say that in Hegel's reading of De Anima, you get a sort of glimpse of a way of seeing his mode of thinking that's realized not just in bioeconomy and governance, but that in a certain sense, the digital technology or digital object sort of foretells its ends in the Heideggerian sense, its ends. And I was wondering, it's a very brief passage, but I think it's one of the most striking critical passages in the text. I was wondering if you could just elaborate a bit on this understanding of Heidegger's reading of the soul here as something that digital technology finds sort of its ends in, or we find its ends rather in the digital object, in digital technology.
Yeah, well, actually, I deal with this question in length in recursivity and contingency. In chapter 2, I started with Hegel. At the very beginning, I said that machine and sovereignty is the third volume after recursivity and contingency, because there is a continuation. And that means I cannot repeat what I have said in the same book, so I can only make reference to recursivity and contingency. So I think there would be, if readers really wanted to grasp my engagement with the question of recursivity, then the reader will have to start from recursivity and contingency, because it is a methodological reading of the history of modern European thought. That I try to actually, let me go back to recursivity and contingency. My central argument is that the third critique of Immanuel Kant, the critique of judgment, has imposed a new condition of philosophizing, let's say in the year of 1790. And this new condition of philosophizing means that for philosophy to be organic. It's because Kant was very much haunted by mechanism, by machines, by mechanism, and Kant saw the difficulty of overcoming it as well. Of course, in Descartes and so on. So the idea, the concept of organism that was developed at the time by the Naturphilosophen, but also the medical doctors or physiologists, actually gave Kant a lot of inspiration to think about philosophy. So there is a link between philosophy, history of philosophy, and epistemology that this close relation we cannot ignore, because the Kantian way of philosophizing was very much informed by the opposition between mechanism and organism. So I elaborate in recursivity and contingency my reading of Kant's third critique, and that I try to interpret this history through the history of the two notions, recursivity and contingency. So recursivity, and I continued after Kant. I continued the question of recursivity in Hegel, in Schelling, and also in cybernetics. Because what we found in the opposition between mechanism and organism, well, let me try to reduce as the following. And I have to say that I simplify it, but in mechanism, let's say the mechanism of the 17th century and early 18th century, the best thing to demonstrate is a clock, a mechanical clock. But we know that if one part of it is broken, the clock can never work again. Right. So if one gear is broken, the clock will stop. Is because in mechanism, what we found is a linear causality. A cause is followed by effect becomes cause, and so on and so forth. It's a linear. So when one part is broken, it's finished. But in organism, what we found is a non-linear causality. Let's say when you when you find a when you see a spider in your house and by accident you take off one leg. Please don't. But if in case you did this, you observe that the spider, even without with one leg missing, is able to balance the body, right? And because there is a different causality at play, which I call recursive causality or recursivity. So the kind of recursive returning to itself in order to know itself. Something we could call the soul. We can find as what characterized the soul in Plato. Like if you read Phaedrus, when Plato suddenly invoked the soul is that which returned to itself. Because in order to claim that the soul is immortal, that is always it's like a spiral in Plato's Phaedrus. But it's not the same in Aristotle. It's almost linear again. And when Hegel developed his reading of Aristotle, he actually imposed a recursive reading of the soul in Aristotle. And the Aristotelian scholars, of course, reject Hegel by saying that, Hegel is hey, you shouldn't do this because you misread Hegel. You misread Aristotle. There is no such a spiral form of the soul in Aristotle. And Hegel apparently trying to impose it by saying that the soul is recursive, like a spiral. So Hegel developed, of course, this much further, and then in a different way, different from Kant and different from Schelling, developed into something I called mechano-organism. A mechano-organism, because in Schelling, the concept of nature is very different from Hegel, because for Hegel, the concept of nature is when he's when Hegel says in the encyclopedia that there is a feebleness of the notion in nature, because nature is a contingency. There is a contingent. There are many contingencies in nature. For example, someone might have 6 fingers. So, a parrot may have 2 heads. These are contingent. And they're contingent because the notion, the belief is still too weak. So nature has to be overcome, and that is the transition from nature to spirit. So this particular way of reading of Hegel actually leads me to understand a very close relation between Hegel and cybernetics. Because we know that cybernetics is actually the essence of cybernetics, of course, is the feedback loop, the recursive movement. And this was made clear by Gerhard Günther, a German Hegelian. Gerhard Günther wrote his PhD thesis on Hegel's logic at the Freie Universität in Berlin. And then he went to the USA, and then he learned about cybernetics, and he became a cybernetician by himself. And Gerhard Günther's argument is the following. Again, let me simplify. His argument is not cybernetics realize a multi-value logic. And this multi-value logic realized by cybernetics is also the realization of the Hegelian logic. Now, this kind of recursive structure of returning to itself in order to know oneself and then continue and so on. So Gerhard Günther's thesis, and that in his one of his books, where in several books he returned to the close relation between Hegel and cybernetics. This book, of course, was read by Heidegger. Heidegger read the book of Günther very carefully, and years ago I heard that there is an annotated copy in the archive of Heidegger of Günther, and where actually did I think Peter Sloterdijk told me that he said he saw it himself, that there was this book that Heidegger was reading Gerhard Günther and annotated this book very carefully, and he also recommended this book to his students in Freiburg. There is, to be brief, there is a long history. And there is a very historical analysis that I have done in recursivity and contingency. So the passage that you read in Machine and Sovereignty is basically a condensed a statement that I already developed in recursivity and contingency. In order to show that Hegel's reading of Aristotle, but also the kind of recursivity that we find in Hegel, is fundamental for us to understand the relation between what I call the political form in Hegel and technology. Especially when Hegel talked about institutions, talking about about constitution and so on.
No, I really appreciate that, and I think that the way that you deal with the careful, even in the brevity, the carefulness you apply to Hegel's position is I think a unique one. In closing, with the final question, I'm going to engage in a little bit of, I don't know, academic narcissism or some self sort of serving here. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about in the following passages, I'm not sure if it's directly after, but you delve sort of deeply into the new sphere and the work of Teilhard de Chardin, who was extraordinarily influential and yet increasingly unexamined, sort of almost completely forgotten now. And I found the inclusion of this to be really helpful, especially in a work that's trying to show how planetarization became possible, and then finally what its kind of implications or philosophical realizations were. And as someone who works sort of extensively on biopolitics and disability and the history of eugenics, I was wondering if you could just speak sort of briefly about what you think the Planetary might reveal to us about biopolitical modernity, about concepts like the human terrain, and, you know, sort of the move in more right-wing movements about, you know, human biodiversity and all of these re-emergent sort of attempts at grasping the human being or humanity as an intelligible entity that must be reduced metaphysically and then refined. Because it seems to me that one of the sort of passing themes in this text is not just the Planetary, but of course this question of locality, and part of that locality, part of addressing this question en medio, as one might say, is of course seeing how what Heidegger called the supreme danger, right? The folding or falling in of the very thing that orders us being that which is also being ordered. So I was wondering if you could just speak to sort of the relationship between this intervention in planetarization and its relation to politics, eugenics.
I actually already do with Teilhard de Chardin in the last chapter of recursivity and contingency. So this is actually also a continuation, but from a different perspective, because Teilhard de Chardin is a very interesting figure, because first of all, he was a Jesuit, but he had a difficult relation to the Vatican because he is also trained as a scientist. He was a paleontologist. He was sent to China as a punishment and he spent really long time of almost 2 decades in China. He participates in the discovery of the Peking Man with many paleontologists, archaeologists from everywhere in the world. He traveled a lot in China, but also in Asia when he was stuck because of the war and so on. And of course, his most famous work is he has published many brilliant books. And the most well-known one is The Phenomenon of the Human, or the human phenomenon, where he tried to describe the emergence of the human as a particular form of intelligence. And it's through the human, or maybe you can say the human phenomenon is a history of, belong to the history of intelligence. So before the human, there are other intelligence, there are other consciousness, for example, plants and animals. But when the human emerged, then it produced a different landscape of intelligence. Because before human, there was something we can call the noosphere. We know that is from the geologist who was a friend of and so on. And so let's say that before the emergence of the human phenomenon, there was already a biosphere. And biosphere is actually the emergence of consciousness, the development of consciousness. But with the emergence of the human phenomenon, what we see is that the biosphere is covered by another layer, which he called noosphere. So it's a kind of different intelligence. This intelligence is mediated by technology. So the technological planetarization is the realization of the noosphere in the sense of Teilhard de Chardin. So, but for Teilhard de Chardin, he is a very interesting, he's a brilliant, but at the same time, it can be also very banal, because he was also under the pressure to reconcile science and theology. So the noosphere, if you say, what is the future of the noosphere? Well, he will say that, at the end, what revealed is the kingdom of God. Right, that's the only way you can, that's the only way you can say as a theologist that you cannot. So we have to reconcile the development of the noosphere and the kingdom of God. But Teilhard de Chardin was discovered, of course, by the Silicon Valley in around the 1990s, when the internet, after the birth of the internet. And Wired, the magazine, had a special in 1995, has a special report that the philosopher, the theologists who anticipated the internet was Teilhard de Chardin, and of course now he's further appropriate as the Homo Deus. You can think that the development of that is, we can say, planetary intelligence, planetary computational intelligence, or technological singularity, or Homo Deus, and so on. And I think this is something that really block our imagination today to think about our relation to technology, our relation to the earth. And so I found that Teilhard's writing fascinating, but at the same time, I think we need to be very critical of what he was saying there, with the realization of the noosphere, or what you call the noospheric reflection, or the omega point, and so on. But what I propose is something quite different, because in the book I propose a new matrix to deal with the planetary problem. One is biodiversity. The second is noodiversity, the same news as a new sphere. And the third is technodiversity, which we discussed earlier. And I wanted to re-examine the relevance of noodiversity in relation to the grand discourse on the planetary artificial intelligence and the Homo Deus and so on, by returning to the question of locality, but also a renewed relation between locality and technology. Why? Because in the 21st century, the relation between locality and technology is antagonistic. We find in Heidegger, technology is going to destroy the villages. Technology is going to destroy the locality, and the Federsweg is no longer the same as what it was of his time. So locality has been always understood as antagonistic to industrial technology and so on. And this is, of course, today we see it again in the right-wing movement, the return to locality. And when I was working on locality, on the concept of locality, of course, I was very much repulsed by saying that, this sounds really right-wing, locality. But I think that we need to fight on this vocabulary, because today, if you read the rhetorics of Marie Le Pen in France, it's locality. If you read the rhetorics of the AfD in Germany, it's locality. But I think we shouldn't, just simply give them the vocabulary. We need to reinterpret the concept of locality and to develop a new relation between locality and technology. So that's something I try to discuss in details in the book, because the right wing question is a very complicated one and a historical one. Actually, I deal it more with a small book that just came out this month, as we are called the post-Europe. That I try to deal with the question of the rise of the extreme right, but also the geopolitical confrontation between the East and West, and because I think that it's getting worse today, especially in the past weeks when we read that North Korea is sending army to Russia and so on, and we are in a situation of the opposition between the East and West, and that was something already that characterized the Cold War. I mean, it has a lot of discussion on that, and in the book I also return to these discussions. So I wanted to re-articulate the relation between technology and locality. And that's why the question of noodiversity and the question of technodiversity is central to this discourse.
I think that's a quite grand place to sort of close the discussion. I think that's the perfect place at the point of stakes. But just in closing, I know that we'll get to the book, but is there anything that you're working on now, that you have coming up regarding machine and sovereignty that you want to tell us about?
You mean what kind of new books I'm writing?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I think that'd be helpful for the listeners as well. If you want to share, you don't have to.
I mean, I've been working since a long time. I book on Immanuel Kant because that's, as I said, that for me, Kant is very important to understand the history of modern European philosophy. So, and the Kant, of course, appeared in all of my books, and I wanted to work out something more systematic. But of course, there were some other things I've been working on, because every project lasts really long time. That each book took me really long time to finish, and I think different writers, different authors has a different way to end the book. Some people cannot end it, and some people end it too quickly, and what might be the best moment to end a book. Whereas it involves also a lot of psychological struggle as well, because you want it to be complete, but at the same time you know that things can never be complete as it is. So, but for me, always trying to work on problems that I could not resolve.
Perfect. And in the spirit of ending, I don't know which artist I'm quoting, but we cannot ever end. The best we can do is to abandon. So let's abandon our audience with the reminder that Machine and Sovereignty will be out on October 29th through Minnesota University Press. You can get it there or wherever bookstore you go to that carries a Minnesota University Book Press, Minnesota University Press books. Of course, it's going to be a flagship title with them. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on, Yuk Hui, for talking about your work with us, and we hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. Yeah, have a nice evening.